Introduction to the Study of the Hindu Doctrines by René Guénon. I have the book right here with me that I have been reading from, and I'm not too sure if this will be inverted or not, but this was quite the journey. Just, I don't know if you can see, but quite a lot of green highlights here and there. And I do apologize that it took me a while to read this. It's because since September I had a sudden life routine shift and change, and so my reading habits were not as great to adjust to, but I am slowly getting there. But yes, my reading progress was quite long, and it took me a while to decipher this book, as well as when I read in general, especially if it's a non-fiction book that I'm learning from. I like to really try to digest and let unique concepts that are new to me marinate. I like to use that word, marinate, so I can actually process it to the best of my ability and not rush these things, because if it was easy, everyone would be knowledgeable, right? So it's more or less pushing the boundaries of my own conscious awareness, my own brain, I suppose, and my thoughts. So I wanted to make sure that I was delivering a video where I can actually be useful and provide some valuable insights. So hopefully I achieved that. I do have my laptop with me for a lot of context and quotes I will be reading from. I had a comment on one of my previous videos that they didn't really find me engaging when reading from the screen, and that I should be more to the camera, and I take that feedback, so I will try my best to try and be as engaging as possible whilst giving the wisdom that Guénon had given. So, context. So there's 3 to 4 major points to know about Guénon when he was writing this book in particular. So he was in Paris at the time. He was in the intellectual and cultural hub of France at the time, and this environment exposed him to a lot of philosophical and spiritual currents, including occultism, theosophy, and of course Eastern traditions. The shift from occultism, so earlier in his life, if you're not familiar with my video on René Guénon and his background in general, I will put a link to that video in the description. He was involved with various occult and esoteric groups, including the Theosophical Society and the Martinists. But by early 1920s, he had distanced himself from those movements and essentially came to criticize for their lack of authenticity and distortion of traditional doctrines, which he definitely mentions in here. In fact, there is a dedicated chapter to theosophy, and he just tears it apart. The third point to come across is his intellectual solitude. So Guénon wasn't necessarily writing mainstream thoughts and academia, and was amongst contemporary intellectuals. He came from a unique perspective, and so it meant he was relatively solitary in his endeavors, and he still had support. He had a small but dedicated group of followers and correspondents who supported his work. This includes the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. He liked this book in particular and actually recommended it for publication, which was essentially René Guénon's first book that was published in 1921, and that same year he also published a series of articles in the Catholic's Journal where he denounces theosophy as a pseudo-religion, which he does in here as well. And last but not least, during this time he was married to Beth Lowry, if I've pronounced those names correctly. So in 1918, Guénon married Beth. She was a devout Catholic. The marriage was not particularly happy, and Guénon's intense focus on his intellectual pursuits may have contributed to tensions in their relationship, especially if he was venturing out in different religions and Eastern traditions, and his wife was a devout Catholic. I think that would put a lot of different perspectives and shifts within communication within a marriage. And so that is the context of what was going on with him whilst writing this book. I want to quickly discuss some criticisms that I just straight off the bat can think of for this book. And the first thing that comes to my mind is, I mean, this is a translated book in English. He wrote his version in French. And honestly, even in English, I did find it quite hard to sometimes understand his sentence structures. As simple as that, I did find most of his sentences very long-winded, about 6 lines, loads of commas, loads of clauses that just broke apart some trail of thoughts or trails of thought. And it was quite hard to try and conceptualize and fully understand the points he was making. And it led me to reread a few times, and that definitely contributed in my delay or in my long journey of getting through this book and making notes on it. However, there are some highlights where he articulated some points so profoundly that I just had to take pictures of it and keep it with me for future references, because I don't think I could have done a better job or could know anyone as of now to have done a better job than he did in some points. There were many highlights in this book. I could not bring them all to this video because it would just be a shorter version of his book, essentially. But I have selected and summarized a good chunk of quotes into topics that I feel like is useful to discuss and get a vibe and feel of what he was trying to convey in this book. So, and another criticism actually before I jump onto the first topic, because it does relate. If you are a Westerner, particularly a European, you will find it hard. You may find it really difficult to get through this book, in the sense that Guénon, even though he was a French Catholic man at a point in his life, the way he speaks about Western Orientalists can be off-putting, because he just criticized and tore them apart with no remorse. He does it so eloquently, but I can understand if this insults or offends Westerners. I can understand both sides to it, because Guénon is really expressing his frustration on all the mistakes that had been made, especially during the times of colonialism and the mentalities that brought from Europe on other Eastern traditions, countries, doctrines. There's a sort of mentality which I will raise that he calls the classical prejudice. But I wanted to make a statement that I do acknowledge this. However, if you could put that aside, this book really is a gem in understanding the other line of thought, the other side to it. And really, if you can not let your ego get hurt from this, you are pushing your own boundaries into that Socratic approach of trying to be the best version of yourself that you can be. And of course, I'm saying this to Westerners directly, because this book was essentially designed and addressed to the Western Orientalists. Now, I will start with the first section, Presumptions of Westerners. So the first quote I have here is, "The fact is that a knowledge of grammar and an ability to make a word-for-word translation are not in themselves sufficient to enable a person to enter into the spirit of a language, to assimilate the thoughts of the people who read and write it." So the first thing that he kind of covers in this section, which, by the way, I think it's worth mentioning before I forget, how the book is split into. So he has 3 broad sections, if I can find the contents. Yes. So he has 3 parts. One is preliminary questions. The second is the general character of Eastern thought. And part 3, the Hindu doctrines. Sorry, there's a 4th part, Western interpretations. I will put a picture of the contents for each part alongside this video so you can all see. The first part, which is preliminary questions, he brings up classical prejudice, the divergence between the East and the West, and also brings up linguistic difficulties, questions of I can't say the word, chronology? Yes, and essentially just the mentality of or towards antiquity. So the first quote already, straight off the bat, really acknowledges how language barriers really do convey different mentalities and different thoughts. You have Western and you have Eastern. And he also goes into what he defines as Eastern. He acknowledges that you cannot split the world simply between two, in East and West, but for the sake of a generalization, he explains what he defines as Eastern, which is essentially China, so the Chinese civilization, the Hindu civilization, with a bit of the Buddhist, and as well as the Islamic civilization, the Muslims. And then with the East, he just defines it all as European, because whilst there are different cultures within Europe, of course, different countries and different traditions, he classifies that they all follow the same mentality, whereas it's not the same in Asia and the eastern side of the world. As you can see, Asia is a massive continent, and the Chinese culture is far from being any close or similar to South Indian culture or just Indian culture in general. So yeah, just wanted to put that out the way. So I feel like that quote speaks for itself. It makes logical sense. The next one is, at the same time, they introduce all the perceived notions which go to make up their own particular mentality with the manifest intention of forcing theories they are studying in the habitual framework of European thought. There's an occurring theme that Guénon emphasizes, where he finds that Westerners have a limited scope where they can only think within that scope, and the only way they could interpret Eastern doctrines and philosophy philosophy is a Western term, but modes of thought within that scope. And he is criticizing that, and he's saying that you cannot do this. You have to break that scope and essentially try and put yourself in the position of an Eastern person, and then try to understand their works rather than doing it from your own shoes. The first condition for the correct interpretation of any doctrine is to make an effort to assimilate it by placing oneself as far as possible at the viewpoint of those who conceived it. Such a man must be content, within the limits of what is possible, to expound the ideas he has understood, while carefully abstaining from any thought of popularization and without worrying in the slightest about trying to compel the convictions of other people. So again, he's criticizing a lot about how Westerners approach in trying to convey information, and the idea of mainstream thought, getting everyone to understand something, but if it means to there's a better way of saying this, but if it means to dumb it down a little bit, then it's not worth it, because you're losing the authenticity and originality of what those texts are or were intending to portray. There is a lot throughout the book where he criticizes Western thought, and some of them I've highlighted and I thought, oh wow, that is quite direct, blunt and honest, but I do find myself agreeing with some of them, if not most of them, as someone who is ethnically Eastern living in the West. And this leads me on to classical prejudice, which is probably one of the most important topics that he brings to this book, because it is very evident. Even to this day, I have experienced classical prejudice amongst British nationalists and royalists, and most of them do not all have this classical prejudice, but actually, I take that back. Most of them do, but most of them do not mean it in an ill intent, but I have experienced those that do and look down at the other side of the world as a separate civilization that should have no bearings towards this country in particular. And I would always see the hypocrisy in some of their statements, in some of their thought patterns, but I wasn't exposed or intellectual enough to really give it back at the time, but my gut feeling or my intuition knew that there was more to it, and I suppose discovering Guénon shed a light into that arena for me because he brought the receipts. So, classical prejudice. What does Guénon define classical prejudice as? Classical prejudice, it consists essentially in a predisposition to attribute the origin of all civilization to the Greeks and Romans. Believe it or not, there are a lot of people I have met that believe this. They truly believe that the Greek antiquity and Roman antiquity were both the underpinning of intellect for a worldwide civilization, global movement. And I'm not to undermine that they hadn't built, they hadn't made such a big impact, but to think that that is the origin of all is, quite frankly, barbaric for me to even hear, let alone comprehend that people actually think this. But it is very evident. It is true, there are people that believe this, but I will leave the harsh criticisms to Guénon on this. So he classifies that Europeans, he brings up this theme that they believe in progress and in evolution. And because my previous book review video was on Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy, and Huxley is no stranger to criticizing progress and evolution, particularly in the technology domain and materialism, I really liked my timing and my journey of learning Guénon's book after this one, because I see the link between them two, and it would be very interesting to know the conversations that they could have had if they were in a room together. Especially modern Westerners appear to be endowed with changeable and inconstant natures, hankering after movement and excitement, whereas the Eastern nature shows quite the opposite characteristics. So Westerners, especially in the field of science and technology, in comparison to the East, we, throughout our history, I say our history because I've grown up as a Westerner, but yeah, throughout our history, we have been making vast exponential progress, exponential arguably, and in comparison to the Eastern, we have this emphasis or this priority of just constantly trying to innovate and create new discoveries. We're always trying to get to that perfect future, that utopia future, but it's never ending. And Huxley does raise this thought as well in the perennial philosophy, at least, I'm pretty sure, that it's always going to be continuous and ongoing. Whereas, and I have encountered people where they look down on Eastern cultures and societies and civilizations, where one person in my life had said something along the lines of, but they haven't made that many discoveries in science, so they're clearly not like developed enough. And I just didn't know how to process this in particular, because at the time I didn't know as much as I do now. But intelligence, defining intelligence is already a philosophical discussion. There are different types of intelligence, and there are different priorities for different civilizations and societies. A bit off topic, but I recently watched a video where a man that the Westerners will say is from a third world country. I would have to pull up this video. He just is a bit bewildered and says, we're third world? We're civilized. What makes you think we're not civilized? And he said something like, you think civilized is achieving all these scientific progress or something like that. I am diluting it heavily, but he says, but does your civilization know how to communicate with each other? Does your civilization believe in higher power, in God? Does your civilization love each other? Are they connected as much as we are? We don't need all these material progress to cultivate that harmony within our people. And it really fits with this quote, because different civilizations, different priorities. I think that's all there is to it. Guénon does say as well, Easterners show a strongly marked tendency to disregard applications. This is quite understandable, because anyone who, above everything else, cultivates the knowledge of universal principles can only take a lukewarm interest in special sciences, bestowing upon them at the post a passing curiosity, which would anyway be unlikely to call forth a large number of discovering in this order of ideas. I will get onto the topic of metaphysics, because that is a whole discourse within this book that Guénon brings up. It's the core meat of the Eastern doctrines in all of them, and they all have their own interpretations of this universal principle. And the logic does make sense to me here, in the sense of, if you have a strong foundation and belief of the universal principle, or at least what you believe to be is the underlying reality, the primordial reality, etc., then studies such as special sciences, biology, physics, chemistry, psychology, they are but just a passing genuine interest, but it's not a grasp of trying to find the ultimate truth, because that is where the metaphysical doctrines lie for the Eastern civilizations. And there have been many scientists throughout our history from the East that have made wonderful discoveries, but still in line with their tradition and faith, which I will bring up what Guénon defines as tradition. Arguably in Europe, especially with the Catholic Church and Christian thought, a lot of sciences were hindered by the belief of religion and how society was structured according to religion, but that was not the case in the East, especially with the metaphysical side within the Hindu civilization and the Buddhist and the Chinese, where exploration of sciences were essentially encouraged and not discouraged. And so there wasn't it's either religion or science, or metaphysics and science. It was more so a intertwining, what's a way to articulate this? A sort of relationship, a partnership that intertwined between those two. It wasn't one set as an opposition to the other. It is agreed a priori that everything must have come from the Greeks, that it is the Greeks who held the monopoly of knowledge in antiquity, just as the Europeans imagine themselves to possess it today, and that they were the appointed educators of humanity. Nevertheless, Plato, whose evidence ought not to be doubted in this connection, was not afraid of recording in his Timaeus that the Egyptians looked on the Greeks as children. What a powerful statement to make. I really like the phrase appointed educators of humanity. There's a bit of a sarcastic tone in Guénon's words throughout the book, or at least we would modernize it as sarcasm. I don't think sarcasm was a term back then, maybe, but it's a beautiful play on with words, because unfortunately that discourse still remains today, that prejudice, those thoughts. And again, I could go on about this, but it is the way that most of these countries have built their education system to be quite nationalistic and patriotic. And so censoring some information or making it heavily biased benefits the government, and having its people be drawn towards that mode of thought, it kind of hides away historical failures or just anything to be embarrassed of, maybe. I'm not too sure, but there is bias in the education system, and it's not necessarily the Westerners' fault if they have this classical prejudice to a certain extent. I suppose when you grow up and you meet new people, then there lies the responsibility to ask questions. So, mode of thought across civilizations. This was incredibly interesting, and I really tried to summarize this. And it's more or less how Guénon, he categorizes the different civilizations by their mode of thought, because different civilizations think differently, which would make logical sense. So the first part, he says, that really stood out to me personally from this book is, and obviously from my own experience coming from a Muslim background, on the other hand, what we have said about the former unity of Christendom and essentially traditional unity conceived according to the specifically religious mode can also be applied fairly closely to the conception of unity in the Muslim world. Islam is in fact the one that approaches closest to the West, and it might even be said in some respects to occupy an intermediary position between East and West. I found this statement quite interesting as someone that is interested in the relationships and the involvement between Christianity and Islam throughout our world history. There's quite a lot that had gone on within many different countries, some that we were taught at schools, but some that were left out conveniently. And so I do agree with this, I think. I can see that Islam, because of its involvement during the Crusades and as well as just the Ottoman, the Turks as well, they, compared to the other Eastern civilizations, they are probably the ones that were most closest to the West, not to mention the Islamic Golden Age during Rome's Dark Age period, where loads of texts were preserved because they were translated in Arabic. In Islam, tradition exists under two distinct aspects, one of which is religious. It is upon this aspect that the general body of social institutions is dependent, while the other aspect, which is purely Eastern, is wholly metaphysical. I find this incredibly interesting personally, and I'm bringing this up because I was brought up from a Sunni background, and it was only within the past 5 years I had an awareness that there were other sectors like Shia Muslims and Sufi Muslims. Only the past 2 to 3 years, 2 years maybe, I only just discovered Sufism, which is shocking because it just feels like a whole different civilization that had been left out, and it's still part of the Muslim world. And so Sufism is more metaphysical, and obviously Sunni, and as much as I know of Shia, it's more religious, and in comparison to Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, they are all pretty much metaphysical. They don't really have that religious mode in comparison to the Abrahamic religions, and I think this is why Guénon is saying how Islam is sort of in the middle between the West and the East, because it holds both the metaphysical and the religious side. There's two sectors arguably in Islam, and two perspectives you could see, because I know that there are a lot of religious Muslims that would not be able to comprehend or agree with the metaphysical doctrine because their mode of thought is different, but nonetheless Islamic metaphysics have shaped a lot of what we know of metaphysics today. Another quote: That is to say, of a religion that has become more or less completely a department of the state, and which as such is in great danger of being turned into a political instrument. So this is Guénon's criticism of essentially mixing religion with politics. It's very prone, and Aldous Huxley had made a lot of remarks on that within the perennial philosophy. It's a very strong but valid point to make, especially within the history of different empires, not just the Christian ones, but also the Muslim ones, and also possibly like the Mughal empires as well. But I think the elephant in the room is the Catholic Church and its involvement throughout many historical periods. It is prone to corruption, all of them, because it's where humans are involved, not necessarily the religious doctrines itself. And so he says, he categorizes the West as more religious, Islam religious and metaphysical. He says Hinduism is basically entirely metaphysical. And then with the Chinese, and Buddhism as well, metaphysical. But with the Chinese, he says metaphysical through Taoism, but Confucianism, he brings that up, and I found it really interesting because he described the Chinese mode of thought to be about social status through family, and there were a lot more quotes that I would love to bring up in this video about that and how, a bit more on the Chinese mode of thought, but for this video, I had to leave them out, but perhaps in the future videos, I'd like to explore that a lot more, maybe through the Taoist-related topics that I would like to speak on. Next section is Metaphysics versus Theology. Now, I don't mean to say versus as in they're in competition with each other, but more so just kind of establishing the differences, which is what Guénon does. So he describes metaphysics as essentially whatever lies beyond physics. In reality, only something that is limited is capable of definition, whereas metaphysics is on the contrary, by its very nature, absolutely limited, and this plainly does not allow of our enclosing it within a more or less narrow formula. I really like this quote. It's a great definition. And I will go ahead with the next quote to really tie it in. The truly metaphysical can only be that which is absolutely stale, permanent, and independent of all contingencies, and in particular of historical contingencies. That alone is metaphysical, which does not change, and it is also this universality of metaphysics that constitutes its essential unity, precluding the multiplicity of philosophical systems and religious dogmas alike, and hence that confers on it its profound immutability. This is an example of what I meant at the beginning, where his sentences are incredibly long and it takes a while to get your head around it, but, well, at least for me, that do not come from a academic literary background, struggling here. But I do apologize, my camera died midway, so I'm currently charging it whilst recording it, which I probably should have done to begin with. But anyways, I will continue from where I last left off, which was trying to describe metaphysics, and essentially something that is immutable. It is the primordial. I keep saying that word because it really is in my opinion, the best description for it. Whatever lies beyond physics, but it cannot be boiled down to a formula. It cannot be contained. It's limitless, and it transcends these philosophical systems and religious dogmas, but also it can be present in its underlying of them, if I'm making sense right there. He goes on to say, since the metaphysical point of view, in its essential immutability, is the very negation of the notions of evolution and progress. One might say, in fact, that metaphysics can only be studied metaphysically. I find this interesting. He's basically saying that it's the opposite of evolution and progress. And I do agree, because if metaphysics is supposedly trying, or is supposed to be a description of all that is, the primordial reality, then how can you progress and evolve further than all that is when it is everything right here, right now? It's timeless. It's not subjected to a certain point in history or a certain civilization or culture or religious dogma, as Guénon has mentioned. And so this ties in a lot to the next quote, where Guénon says, Westerners have never known metaphysics in its entirety. And it's essentially because they prioritize evolution and progress. Throughout history, I don't know if I've got a quote for this, but Guénon mentions how tradition in the West only has strong connotations to when its religion was thriving, but other than religion, there is no sense of tradition. And it could be because of that there's a lack of understanding in metaphysics, because tradition, or at least the primordial tradition, is a form of metaphysics, arguably synonymous. And so throughout history, the West have come from that tradition that was attached to religion, and now it's become more secular and more towards materialism and progression and technological evolution and progression. And obviously with AI, nuclear warfare, technology, social media, politics, look how far we've come. Of course, this is still applicable to the eastern side of the world, but that's because, and if they have adopted the Western mentality, but it is labeled with the West. It is associated with the Westerners, their lack of understanding of metaphysics. And because it's become so dominating, it's started to influence a little bit of Eastern side with skyscrapers, with its architecture, losing its originality and culture, which I really do advocate we need to preserve cultural heritage. And so Guénon mentions a difference between a metaphysical doctrine and a religious dogma. He goes on to basically, that is the difference between religion and metaphysics. He also then goes to say, it follows that a doctrine that adapts itself to the requirements of sentimental beings, and that must therefore itself put on a sentimental dress, can henceforth no longer be identified with absolute and total truth. I love this. If you have to change the religious doctrine to its people, then it surely cannot be the absolute truth. Otherwise it would have been, and I quote, right in the first time. That is food for thought. And that is, I suppose, a criticism that a lot of Muslims have with the Bible, and how there have been many versions over time. And, growing up, I can only see how Muslims believe that the Quran was preserved and never changed, and that itself has that metaphysical aspect of it had never been changed. These are the direct words, and so we follow those direct words. And that may be the case for other doctrines within the other Eastern traditions. I'm not too sure, but I know that is the general discourse with that topic between those two religions. Maybe with Hebrew as well, though I'm not too sure. And so the next section is a bit similar, where instead of metaphysics versus theology, it's metaphysics versus philosophical thought. Now, I had to highlight these words and take pictures of them, because it really opened my mind and shifted my perspective towards philosophy as a whole. And I will explain why. So the first quote is, "This in itself should suffice to show that these theories are devoid of any real value, being built up by each individual philosopher solely as a belated justification for his own conduct and that of his fellow men. or at least of those who are most in sympathy with him, in accordance with his own views, and above all, with his own feelings. Over the summer in 2023, I started a whole course, a massive philosophy course, Western philosophy. And I never got around to finishing it because it was just an incredibly long course, but I do plan to. It's something that I enjoyed. But when it started from antiquity and then going all the way through to Immanuel Kant and Karl Marx and a bit of the later philosophers in our modern history, though it seemed to me at the time there were just so many characters, all having their own thoughts, which makes sense. That's essentially what happened. But each philosophy was, according to that man in particular, in sympathy with his own views, and it was almost like it was in his own bubble. Each philosopher had their own bubble of thoughts and followers and their own views, but above all, their own feelings. And when I read this from Guénon, it really made sense how it's hard to really pinpoint and say, I follow this one philosophy and that is it. Because what you're saying is, I follow this one man and that is it. And it's quite hard because there are so many philosophical concepts that overlap with each other. I like a bit of knowledge from Stoicism, but then I also like a bit from existentialism and maybe a tiny bit from absurdism, because it's my own journey picking apart things that resonate with me, just as what all these philosophers have done. And they created their own schools around it. But that cannot be the same for metaphysics. And that is what Guénon is defining. He says, a philosophical system is always the system of some particular person. That is to say, a construction, the value of which can only be purely individual. I think that is so powerful. And seeing that articulated, it just put it into a concept for my brain to just truly understand. Otherwise, it would have just been lying in the back of my mind, scattered, and I wouldn't have fully put those pieces together and think, this is true. This is really why metaphysics is something that I am more passionate in, arguably, because philosophical thoughts are very attuned to its teachers in their own manner and as individuals. And then this quote was what tied it all together for me, which was, like many of those to be met with in the history of modern philosophy, are thereby clearly deprived of all metaphysical character, or in other words, are lacking in the character of universality. Moreover, most questions of this kind usually fall into the category of problems enjoying a purely artificial existence. That last part of the sentence is more or less what hit me in the head. Enjoying a purely artificial existence. It made me reflect on all the philosophers that I had studied, albeit I didn't study them in depth. It's more of a generalist knowledge approach that I take, creating problems out of nowhere to then solve them. In comparison to metaphysics, that is essentially what I see philosophy as now, to a certain extent, because an artificial existence, philosophy, and I'm just thinking of the different schools of philosophy, it served its historical time and purpose then and there, and some wisdom is definitely timeless and applicable even to today, and I say this with Stoicism as someone that practices it. But if, and as Guénon mentioned, if it has to have a philosophical system or a religious dogma to tie into, or a certain time in history, it's not exactly universal and part of all that is. It's not part of the Tao or the primordial reality, or, if God is meant to be omnipotent and omniscient and everything that we could possibly capture, then a small subsect of that could not be the ultimate truth, surely. And so this definitely contributed in me now seeing, and I have been seeing this anyway. I see philosophy as something to just enjoy and make videos on and talk about and find wisdom in, but it's not something to denote as the ultimate truth to me, just because I understand from my own experience what reality is like for me and how absolute it is, and just me practicing like manifestation and essentially choosing the experiences I want to experience in my reality. It's a game to me in that aspect. And so I do not usually dwell in philosophy as much as I probably used to when I was trying to seek the truth, because I know it essentially has its own artificial existence in comparison to metaphysics. I do hope I'm making sense here. I think you can see my passion in this discovery, but it really did make a profound impact in myself and just my general realization on this. And so towards the next part of the book, he is using Hinduism, the Hindu doctrines, as an example of the Eastern doctrines. So this book isn't just really, it's a misleading title a little bit, because he does use Hinduism as an example. It is an introduction to the study of Hindu doctrines, but he's making a firm point of this being an example of just Eastern doctrines in general, just to compare the West's philosophical thoughts to the East's metaphysical thoughts. And Hinduism is a great example because it's a fully metaphysical doctrine in comparison to Islam, which has a bit of religious and metaphysical. That may be a confusing example to use. Hindu unity is a unity of a traditional order, purely and exclusively, and has no need to depend upon any more or less exterior form of organization or upon the support of any authority other than that of the doctrine itself. I have not actually studied Hinduism as much as I probably should from an ethnic point of view. Ethnic point of view, yeah. Even though I did not come from a Hindu background, I was still exposed to Hindu cultures when I would be exposed to Bollywood and Indian dramas, etc., growing up in the South Asian community. But there's a sort of power to this statement, because only have I, when I've been reading more upon this subject, the more I've started to understand what the caste system is really about, especially in Guénon's point of view and his way of explaining it. And I really like the idea that there is no single governing body in comparison, say, to the Catholic Church, and there's no authority. It's the doctrine itself that is being followed, and it leads many creative ways for different people of different mental capabilities to follow that doctrine, which makes that doctrine truly metaphysical, and I think that is wonderful. Since nothing of a properly religious nature exists in India, whereas in the West, on the contrary, there is nothing genuinely traditional outside religion. So, as mentioned before, Guénon seeks or spots out that in Western history, tradition has always been tied to religion, and that is it. It has not been in a metaphysical point of view. And then I go on to caste. Guénon describes it as a social function determined by the particular nature of each human being. He then goes on to say, at the same time, it can be seen how absurd is the attitude of those Europeans who feel indignant because a man cannot pass from his own caste into a higher one. In effect, this would imply nothing more nor less than a change of individual nature, or in other words, a man would have to cease being himself in order to become another man, which is obviously absurd. So growing up, my idea of caste, I wasn't very knowledgeable in it, and I'm still not as knowledgeable in it now, but it was more or less on the lines of social status and hierarchy. With different surnames of Hindu friends, it would say what lineage of family they would come from, and if they were coming from farmers or from a higher status. And so I had the Western point of view of, oh, that's not that that's not really nice. Like, you're to judge people upon different castes. I suppose that is inevitable, but I did understand the Western criticism point of view. However, Guénon says that it's not necessarily societal placements, it's the order of human nature, and that is how castes are categorized in Hindu doctrinal mode of thought, at least, maybe not in society, but towards the doctrine. And so if you was to force someone to change caste, it would be absurd, because it's changing the exact nature of who you are, right? It's like, you can be yourself as authentically as possible, or you can just be something completely opposite, and it just sounds barbaric. And so from reading this, it opened my eyes to not be as ignorant towards the caste system, and maybe learn more about it and try to understand it a bit more, because there's something to it, as Guénon has described. And he does go on a lot more in depth with a lot of Hindu concepts about yogi and Vedanta and so many more. Off the top of my head, I can't recall them all, but I did struggle a little bit in that, because I felt like I required a lot more further studying and time to really absorb these terminologies and meanings, especially when it's words of a foreign nature. It's so easy to just read it in your head, but it's just quickly read and it's not properly being taken into. And I want to, if I was to study that, I want it to be a separate video, a separate lecture, and give it its own environment, rather than shoving it all in within this video. But there were many that I learnt and found useful, and he just uses it to try and express more of these metaphysical concepts that the West is evidently lacking in. Now, I will go towards the conclusion. This conclusion is going to be quite long, because as you will see when I say these quotes, these sentences are incredibly long. In fact, I'm looking at one of the quotes and it's 2 sentences, but it could pass as a massive paragraph. But we shall dive in. The reason is that by attempting to bring down the doctrine to the level of the common mentality under the pretext of making it accessible to all, it must inevitably be distorted and denatured in the process. It is not for the doctrine to abase itself or to conform to the limited powers of understanding of the many. It is for individuals to rise, if they can, to an appreciation of the depth of the doctrine in its integral purity. That is one of the quotes I had to take a picture of, because it was wonderfully articulated, even though it was a very long sentence. Incredible. The first thought that comes to mind is the Bible, unfortunately. As much as there's a lot of wisdom in there, having all these different versions for different sectors to conform to their beliefs or the societal communal beliefs at the time, it's degrading its original nature. It's degrading its own metaphysical teachings, because metaphysics, I do believe, does exist in Christianity to some form. It could be in Christian mysticism. I'm sure Meister Eckhart would have done a lot of work on that, at least, or maybe Saint Augustine, the Hippo. And it's quite sad, because maybe that is one of the main reasons why Christianity is unfortunately on a decline, especially with the culture of materialism and progress, and having all these different changes throughout time. It's quite hard to believe that this is the work of God. It makes sense why some people might be losing faith, and we have to criticize that and try to tackle it and try to understand it, rather than completely tearing it apart and judging it, but in a healthy way. And I think this is why in the Islamic community, the preservation of the Quran is incredibly powerful and important to its people because they don't want change. They don't want Islam to conform to the West or to ever-changing society around the world. We conform to that. I saw a quote on Twitter when I used to use Twitter, and it was something like, it's gone now. Something like, if God said it's haram, your opinion doesn't matter, essentially, which was quite humorous. But it's that mentality of tradition. That's where the metaphysical part lies in Islam, or at least one of the ways it does. It is also possible to suppose that mechanical inventions, developed ever further and further, may reach a point where they will seem so dangerous that men will feel impelled to renounce them, either from the terror gradually aroused by some of their consequences, or else following on a cataclysm, I can't say that word, which everyone is at liberty to picture as he pleases. This is very much Aldous Huxley vibe, and it's quite interesting because obviously a good few years later is where the nuclear bomb was invented, the works of Oppenheimer, World War, cryptography, Alan Turing's machine that led on to computers, the internet, mechanical inventions, and now we're in an age where AI is growing even further than it has done before. Cryptocurrency, quantum computing, and all that with many different use cases for the good and for the bad. And so Guénon is quite rightly foreshadowing this, because getting to that stage was because tradition had become a decline, and the West had been the propelling force for that then influenced across the globe, nuclear arms race, etc. And so Guénon says the West, abandoned to its own fate, would sink into the lowest forms of barbarism. Barbarism, yeah. Which is quite I think you can see my energy kind of depletes a little bit. It's quite a morbid, almost sad thought, because I am in the West, and as much as there are a lot of criticisms I have for it, it is still something I don't want to see for its people. I don't want it to see its, architecture degrading into modernism, modern architectures, people becoming more secular, etc. But when I say secular, I mean as in secular mode of thought, living in boxes rather than in beauty, etc. But I do digress. That is another topic I will raise in future videos. Now, this is the long quote, but it's quite powerful. Guénon proposes different ways to mitigate or to try and prevent the West from falling into this barbarism, this fate. And the second proposal that he basically says is what really stood out to me. The second eventuality is the one in which representatives of other civilizations, namely Eastern peoples, in rescuing the Western world from this incurable decay, would assimilate it by consent or by force, either as a whole or in respect of some of its component parts. That is, assuming that the thing were possible and that the East were willing to do this. It is to be hoped that no one is blinded by Western prejudice as not to recognize how much this hypothesis is to be preferred to the first one. Under such circumstances, there would doubtless be a transitional period of extremely painful ethnic revolutions, which are difficult to picture, but which in their final result would be of a nature to compensate for the damage certain to be sustained during a catastrophe of this kind. But in that case, the West would have had to forego its own character and would find itself absorbed purely and simply. King Charles. I believe this statement is what has influenced King Charles, especially as his journey as a prince in this multi-faith community for the UK. And I do truly believe it's an honourable approach. The work and effort he has put to trying to keep peace between many different ethnicities in this country that have supported this country, as much as some might argue that they haven't, with the economy, with exports, etc. But that's another topic. But especially his support in Islam and the studies of it, he has always advocated for the West to learn from Islamic principles and teachings from the traditional point of view, so then the Westerners can then apply it with their own via Christianity. And most people instantly see that as, we don't want Islam in this country, we want it out. But that is not what King Charles is. It's not what he had meant. Especially from this quote, it just makes sense. There would be some sort of an absorption, that the West will have to forego some of its own character if they adopted Islam. I did an essay review on one of King Charles's his speech review as a prince on Islam and the West. I will also tag that in this video. And it's incredibly powerful. I highlight the criticisms that the Westerners will have on this, but also the powerful ways it can truly preserve the cultural heritage of this country in particular. I'm saying it as someone that has been brought up and is British, but of course can apply to other Western countries and European countries, where if we adopt that conviction, not even conviction, that refusal to conform to ever-changing societal values and to stick to tradition, that metaphysical tradition, then so much of the West would be preserved and would be thriving and would become more healthier, in my opinion, as a community, as a civilization, because as Guénon has predicted, it is sinking. And I do believe it is sinking right now further throughout time. And there are a few last quotes to conclude on this book review. We can only say that the Middle Ages afford as an example of a traditional development that was truly Western. I find that interesting because when I was studying philosophy, the Middle Ages is what really drew to me. Peter Abelard and many more that come to mind raised a lot of incredible thoughts criticizing the Catholic Church at the time and Christianity, but in a healthy way where they acknowledge that it's not all that is. Guénon further then says, if there exists a Western tradition, that is where it must be looked for and not in the fantasies of occultists and pseudo-esoterists. And then this last quote I would like to end this book review video on, and is what I would think is his definition of tradition. And I really like it. Tradition, in its innermost essence, is not to be conceived according to the specifically religious mode, which is after all but a case of adaptation to the conditions of the general and average mentality. Tradition is supposed to be timeless, it's supposed to be primordial and metaphysical. And there is a quote that one of my subscribers and someone who frequently comments a lot, called Jamie, giving him a shout out. You know what, I'm going to try and recall this quote, and I loved it so much. He sent it to me via the Substack. Hopefully I can quickly get it. Yes. I love it so much. It's accredited to Gustav Mahler. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. That is incredibly powerful. I thank Jamie for sharing this to me. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. And I would like to end this video on that quote, as well as on my disclaimer that I am by no means claiming to be knowledgeable in everything, except that I am in the humble pursuit of wisdom. I hope you found this video useful, especially if you are interested in the works of Guénon. And for those that already are, I hope I gave a good representation of what he had tried to convey in this book. I look forward to reading more of his works, and as well as in the perennial traditional philosophy. Thank you so much for watching.